What's up, investors? It's the Russian dude. It's no longer a secret that regular Russian people want the war to be over as soon as possible. At least the vast majority of them. As days pass, more and more Russians realize the meaninglessness of this invasion. And they no longer see it as a special military operation, as they know it is a war. Some might still be afraid to say the actual word war in public, but whenever they talk with their friends or relatives, they most certainly use this exact word. I can confirm it based on my own personal experience speaking with some of my friends. And I also hope that the world's perception of Russians is changing as well. I hope that more people around the world realize that this is Putin's war, not Russia's war. The soldiers mostly do not want to be there. They are either forced to be in Ukraine against their will, or they are there for money. Very few join the military because they truly believe in the idea. All this is reflected in the morale and willingness to fight of Russians, who, in most dangerous conditions, will always prioritize their lives over money or fear of being punished by their officers. This is a huge contrast to Ukrainians, who know that if they cannot repel the advancing enemies, they will come after their friends and relatives next. Ukrainians have way more real reasons to fight. We already spoke plenty about the differences between Russian and Ukrainian militaries, so today let's focus on regular people, specifically the people of Russia. Do they really want the war to keep going? Do they truly believe in the idea? What are the percentages of those who disagree with the decisions of Putin? And what are the chances of huge unrest and potentially even civil war starting in Russia? Recently, a poll was conducted to assess the Russian public's readiness to engage in political protests and their stance on anti-war sentiments. But the way questions were asked makes us wonder about the truthfulness and honesty of these responses. I mean, imagine, in a country where you can get jail time just for saying word war out loud. And then they ask you the questions something like this. Do you think protests can happen? Will you participate in them? Do you support Putin's idea to start this special military operation? So I would not be surprised if there were FSB agents listening to the responses of these people, or some suspicious-looking people in hats and sunglasses standing in the crowd, or something like this. So long story short, I don't think that the answers were pretty honest. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyways, let's see what the people of Russia said. Only 15% of respondents believed that political protests could happen in their cities, and a mere 13% expressed willingness to participate. These low numbers suggest a reluctance among citizens to openly voice disagreements, possibly due to fear of prosecution or sense of meaninglessness that they're not gonna change anything. Another interesting thing is that even this kind of survey shows us that those people who believe that protests can start are mostly the same ones who are willing to participate. So next time if you hear a Russian saying that protests are possible, but he or she will not go there, well, most likely this person is lying. But yeah, this survey, or better say, the way questions were asked, it was flawed from the beginning. Because of this, alternative polls by different organizations were made. And they tried to ask different questions but of the same idea. So the results here are way more accurate representation of the Russian public real perception of war. One such initiative is the Chronicles Research Project, which in mid-September conducted telephone interviews with 800 Russian adults. They asked questions about the potential for a new mobilization, attitudes towards a peace deal with Ukraine, and reactions to the Ukrainian incursion into the Kursk region. When asked whether they would prefer a new mobilization or an end to hostilities through a peace deal with Ukraine, 49% favored ending the war through mutually beneficial peace deal, a substantial portion of the population, to say the least, almost 50%. Back in 2023, this percentage was 39%. A significant 10% increase over only 1 year. Only 29% supported a new mobilization, while 22% declined to answer. Those who declined to answer are assumed to be in favor of ending the war as well, but they simply could not reply honestly because of fear that they could be listened by the FSB. After all, it was a telephone call. Next questions asked about the personal willingness to participate in the war effort. and they showed that 29% would refuse under any circumstances, 32% would comply if ordered by the Ministry of Defense, and only 14% would volunteer. Imagine, every seventh Russian man is willing to fight in Ukraine on his own, while simultaneously Putin and his propagandists scream about the never-seen-before unity among the Russian people. Well, people can lie. Data and numbers never do. What's even more interesting is that the majority of those willing to serve were men aged 50 to 60, with less than 7% of young men aged 18 to 24 expressing willingness to fight in Ukraine. It is so easy to be Z-Patriot on steroids when you know that you will never have to risk your life. So personally, I would trust more 7% number of volunteers rather than 14, which does not help Putin's case at all. Comparing these results to similar polls conducted earlier reveals a clear trend. The willingness to participate in the war is declining. In February 2023, 42% were ready to follow government orders to join the military. By September 2024, this number dropped to 32%. And the proportion of those unwilling to participate under any circumstances has increased from 20 to 29%. Another polling group, Extreme Scan, approached the issue differently by asking respondents about the likelihood of men they knew answering a mobilization call. This indirect method aimed to extract more honest responses by removing personal identification with the answer. The findings were the following. 23% believed everyone they knew would join the army, in comparison to 32% who will follow Ministry of Defense orders and 14% volunteers. And 40% said most of men they knew would not join the military in comparison to 29% in previous poll. So as you can see, when you remove the personal responsibility to fight, people are not that much afraid to tell the truth. So these numbers could be even more reliable, because it truly shows the attitude of regular people towards war. To sum up those confusing numbers, I know there was plenty of them, less than a quarter of Russian men are willing to fight, even if they are forced to do so, and just 7% of them will volunteer. And the vast majority, probably more than 70%, want the war to be over as soon as possible. They don't need new territories, they do not understand the purpose of the invasion, and they just want all this to stop and bring back peace. So now, whenever you hear Russian propagandists or some extremist Western media saying that every single Russian unconditionally supports Putin's all decisions, you can clearly see that this is far from the truth as far as possible. The Russian government's approach to the war has had devastating consequences for its own people, particularly the soldiers on the front lines. According to reports from Ukraine's armed forces, up to 653,060 Russian troops have been killed or injured, a figure that surpasses the Soviet Union's total casualties during its decade-long invasion of Afghanistan and both wars in Chechnya combined. These staggering losses are not solely due to Ukraine's incredible defense and international support, but are also a result of Kremlin's own missteps. The so-called partial mobilization in the September of 2022 forced 300,000 reservists into service with minimal training and obviously inadequate equipment. Soldiers were given just 24 hours to report for duty, leaving them little time to prepare or even say goodbye to their families. Stories emerged of conscripts being sent to the front lines within days, lacking proper leadership and resources. Such treatment led to a significant decline in morale and patriotism among even the biggest supporters of the government. As news of the dire conditions spread, thousands fled the country to avoid conscription, while others took to the streets to protest. Examples of military recruitment centers being set on fire and violent confrontations with officials signaled a growing unrest. Instead of addressing these concerns, the government intensified its repressive measures, further alienating its citizens. It was not the very first time the Putin's regime completely abandoned its people in times of most need, but this was definitely one of the most influential events in the history of modern Russia, which clearly separated people into two different camps. War supporters and Z-Patriots on one side, and normal, regular people who just follow common sense and logic on the other side. And with every decision Putin was making later, the separation was growing even further apart. The more you try to change the mindset of people from the opposite camp, the more convinced they become in their own ideology. Imagine yourself right now. If somebody starts to furiously prove you why Russia had to invade Ukraine and why Putin is the greatest president of all times, which reaction will you feel? Well, exactly completely the opposite. You will believe even more in the need of Ukraine to win and that Putin is the worst person ever. The consequences of such interaction will be completely the opposite as well. People from both camps will become even more convinced in their own truth. And it works obviously both ways. September 2022 was the before and after moment for Russia. People started to feel dissatisfaction not just towards politicians, but also towards one another. How can you support Putin and his invasion, says one group. How can you betray your homeland, country and your people, says the other group. In the end, we have two clearly defined opposite groups. And for better or worse, the Putin's regime continued to fuel this hatred by saying that those who do not support the war are pretty much the outcasts, minorities, and people who do not even deserve to be called Russians at all. While in reality, we already see that anti-war people are actually much bigger in their numbers. So, what prevents this situation from escalating into huge countrywide protests, or potentially even civil war? Well, the lack of obvious leaders who can rally people. But this will not last forever. When nations engage in external war, the goals are typically clear. Protect your home, define objectives, recognize enemies, and measurable outcomes such as territorial gains or losses. Civil wars, however, blur these boundaries, creating a landscape where traditional rules no longer apply. In most civil conflicts, sometimes small issues escalate over time, be it historical grievances, political corruption, or social inequalities. Russia's internal conflict is unique because it has been significantly amplified by an external war, the invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin's narrative framed the invasion as a special military operation aimed at demilitarizing and denazifying Ukraine. However, as the conflict dragged on and Kiev resisted the offensive, it became obvious to many Russians that the operation was, in fact, a war of aggression, seeking to undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and identity. This realization sparked a decline in public trust and increased skepticism towards the government's motives. Without a doubt, these are huge problems, but at first it seemed like nothing else beside the actual war mattered. The fighting had to stop as soon as possible and peace restored. As time passed, people of Russia started to realize the true face of Putin. The combination of widespread repression, economic hardships, and a prolonged external war has set the stage for potential large-scale unrests. The government's ruthless tactics may be pushing citizens towards a breaking point. The Wagner Group rebellion in June 2023 served as the best example of how internal divisions can erupt into open conflict and do it literally in a matter of days, if not hours. You can wake up in a completely different Russia after a good night of sleep. This fake sense of stability of Putin's regime is just that, a mere sense. It dulls the senses, makes people feel that the change is not possible, so when a change inevitably happens, it comes as a huge and unexpected shock. As history of Russia shows, monumental things can come seemingly out of nowhere and change everything very fast. There is a small chance of civil war in Russia, those who oppose the war against the supporters, because such confrontations seems a little bit more attainable rather than protesting the government, and taking into consideration that there are just so much more anti-war people, the victory in this potential internal war will mostly likely be achieved by them. As time passes, even Z-Patriots change their views and start opposing the invasion. I've seen many examples of even my friends who were more or less positive towards Putin's invasion at first, but now they are either neutral or against it. I'm yet to see the opposite example. And if the civil war does happen and the victory is achieved by those who follow the truth, then maybe, just maybe, the anti-war sentiment becomes so big that it reshapes the actual anti-Putin protests. And there is a possibility that this can become the beginning of an end of his regime and dark pages of modern Russian history. The time will tell, but the truth always prevails. Well, there you have it, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like this video, subscribe to my channel for more videos like this. If you wish to support my work, there are links down below. Thanks so much for watching. See you tomorrow.
We won't succumb to their tricks, the facade they try to sell. Their twisted words and feeble claims on us all they cannot quell. We see through their lies, their feeble attempts to sway. We do not believe